Friends, just to say that it's wonderful to have the American Academy community reunited after the Turkish explorers have returned, and others in the meantime have been exploring elsewhere. So it's really nice to be back together. The necessary preliminary word about the gelato, the ubiquitous gelato. Don't forget the gelato for the Q&A. David Rubin is the recipient of the Garden Club of America Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture. Educated at Connecticut College and Harvard University, he worked as landscape architect and associate at the firm Hannah Olin in Philadelphia and as a partner at Olin. He's the founder of Land Collective. He's taught and lectured at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, the University of Pennsylvania School of Design, the Arboretum School of the Barnes Foundation, the University of Virginia School of Architecture, and Southern California Institute of Architecture. He's received the Smithsonian's Cooper-Hewitt National Design Award for Landscape Design, as well as awards and honors from the American Institute of Architects, the American Society of Landscape Architects, and the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. His project experience has taken him from Indianapolis to Versailles, from San Antonio to Shanghai, from Tacoma to Berlin and Barcelona, and from Beverly Hills to Grand Cayman Island. This kind of record makes a poet feel like a real stay-at-home. Finally, he is the holder of U.S. patent number 5,524,382 for the Architrellis, a modular and expandable trellis based on the orders of architecture with which I fully intend to equip my small backyard garden in Wayne, Pennsylvania, upon my return to the United States. One of the luxuries of the Rome Prize is that there is no pressure to actually complete the projects the fellow proposes in applying for the prize. Indeed, some of the best projects are not conceived until after the fellow's arrival here in Rome, or even after Rome has become a glowing memory. David Rubin's original Rome Prize project proposal was an excellent one, and it concerned finding new purposes for landscapes apparently ruined by open pit mining, with particular reference to the Guidonia travertine quarry 14 miles east of Rome. The interface between commercial business and creative thinking about the environment is not always smooth, of course, and David discovered before long that this project was not going to work. At the same time, during what he now refers to as his 30 days of panic, he made the momentous decision to leave a practice with which he had been affiliated for 24 years. As David says, quote, "Entropy is continuous," unquote. But it's one thing to observe this as a philosophical principle and another thing to experience it in one's own life. Still, the fact remains that when David was a young landscape architect, he was present when a vision for the AAR campus was created by Hannah Olin Limited in 1990. And now, 20 years on, he himself is re-envisioning the AAR campus, even as he has re-envisioned his own life. His re-envisioning has been made easier, perhaps, by the web of close friendships and the rich buffet of ideas he has encountered here among us. It is for this reason that he's titled his talk tonight, Food for Thought. And David has given the AAR a great deal in return. I think of him, for example, identifying the fields of wild allium through which we walked toward the ruined stadium at Miletus, or coming toward me at the huge ancient stadium of Aphrodisias, holding a nosegay of wild bleeding heart, wild gentian, wild euphorbia, and muscary, which we know as grape hyacinth, just as all of these plants have their counterparts in the modern garden. No trip to Turkey or anywhere else should be without a landscape architect, particularly one of David's gentleness, alertness, and intelligence. Please welcome him now.
Thank you, Carl. Good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you, Carl, for the eloquent introduction. It's really an honor to be here, and more so an honor to be in the presence of such extraordinary talent. I'm absolutely blown away every day by the fact that everybody knows so much more than I ever will in my life. It's really a pleasure to sit with each of you on a regular basis and think new thoughts based on the things that you say. And So what I did tonight is put together a smorgasbord, a tabula calda, if you will. Something will have, there'll be something for everybody, I hope. I'm not an academic. I don't pretend to be. I'm a practitioner. I like reading the things that people write and trying to interpret them into new ideas in my own work, with the hope that someday somebody will look at my work and then write about it, and so on and so forth. The cycle just continues. So I thought at first we would just talk design philosophy. This is a little thing in three parts. The first one being about design philosophy, the second one being about political landscapes as they related to the Grand Tour, and then finally a look at the Academy as an embassy of knowledge. I believe in gravity, which is why this apple is here. I believe that every one of us stands on this earth, and that is the thing that binds us together. So really, we have an association simply by the fact that we have a common ground. And it's the common ground that links us all together. And really, when you believe in that holistically, you then end up making connections with people. That's what a landscape architect does from my perspective. A landscape architect deals with the collective elements, everything that is the land that we stand on, and pushes it in such a way that it is holistically sustainable, thinking primarily about social sustainability and the fact that really if we don't come together in the landscape, we're never going to come together at all. So really that's where my design principles come from. I just wanted to start out with a couple of projects that I have been working on in my 21 years of practice. These are projects that I have undertaken while a partner and owner at Olin. And they were the last things that I did prior to coming to the Academy. The first is the ARC Wildlife Crossing Competition. This took place on I-70 on the pass to Vail, and in the United States, this has the highest rate of collisions between animals and vehicles. It is a significant corridor both in animal terms and in vehicular transportation terms. There is an economy to the road because products get moved across the Rockies, and there is a cross there, an incredible intersection between the wildlife that are migrating north and south. And we were given the premise that this was to be a crossing that could be used anywhere in the world, that it should be modular and appropriate to a landscape that will change because global warming and other issues of the environment suggest that it will never be the same. So if you're trying to allow large animals to cross a significant road, in many different places, you have to have one thing that could be symbol for crossing, that could be effective in the way it moves animals across and allows people to move underneath it. So this is what we came up with. We called it wild crossing, with the X being the operative part of crossing. And it was a modular landscape, one that could be inserted in as necessary, so that as global warming changed the habits of animals and those animals moved to a different location and you needed to track a different type of large animal, then you simply lifted the landscape out and put modules back in that were appropriate to that particular animal. It acted as gateway, so it had to be symbolically appropriate to the threshold that we were trying to create, and it had to act as arc, if you will. So this is the view from above. You can just get a sense here of the arcing quality of this sort of Pringle as it sits across the landscape. And these shapes actually represented the inserted landscape modules. I'm also going home in a week's time to give a tour of this new project. It's about to open in midsummer. It's Canal Park in the Southeast District of Washington, D.C. I was asked to design a park where no neighborhood currently exists. So it had to be flexible and adaptable, and it had to accommodate a range of social issues that I don't even know about because we don't know who the people will be that will be living there. So it really had to run the gambit from very urban at one end to, in some respects, much more open. It had to accommodate many different program elements from fountains and skating rinks to the possibility of live theater and movies at night. And it also had to do something significantly different, which was act as machine. This landscape actually, when it goes online, will not only catch the stormwater from its current location, that is the 3 blocks between 2nd Street and 2nd Place and M and I, it will actually stub out to the adjacent parcels which are yet unbuilt and catch their rainwater as well. And it will be brought onto the park for cleansing purposes, reuse, and eventually, when it is no longer viable, put back into the system. So it also had to work 365 days of the year, so it included a skating rink as well as a cafe and other elements. But look for this when you go back to the United States. It should be open by August and September. Another one is the Philadelphia Navy Yard competition. This is actually in the Navy Yard of Philadelphia, obviously. It's south of the city, where the developer was trying to attract a diverse clientele of both residential and corporate folks. And this project was, again, had to deal with a situation that was in a floodplain. So the water collects very quickly here, and so had to really deal with stormwater in a very positive way. But it also had to do something else, which is build community. And like Canal Park, was trying to insert program elements that would actually allow it to do that. So it also included a landscape that went up over top of the building that housed the local cafe. The idea being that this food would actually supplement the service that was underneath in this cafe here. So this is the garden, what we call the New Victory Garden, and this one is where people would come to meet socially. Another project that's underway presently is being built is Wishard Hospital. It's a catch-all hospital. It's the hospital that works for an entire community. And when I got the call for this, I had an immediate connection with the owner, the CEO of this corporation, because he does what I do. He does in the strata of medical practice what I do as a landscape architect. He has to form a hospital that is appropriate for everyone, whether overprivileged or underserved. He has to deal with all of them. And that's the same philosophy that I have for my work as a landscape architect. I try to incorporate everyone in the landscapes that I design. On top of the clinic of this new construction, it's actually a unique project because it's one of the first projects in the last century to be a whole new hospital lifted and put down. That's rare to have that happen with hospitals. Usually they butt off and become these rabbit warrens of corridors that you all know when you go to hospitals. Well, this one is literally picking up and moving onto a new practice or onto a new site that has one main corridor that runs through it. This happens to be what I call the Sky Farm, which is an edible landscape on top of the clinic building, which serves 2 purposes. One is part of the health services of allowing people to come out and tend to gardens as they're recuperating themselves. It's been proven that actually that type of method actually speeds people's healing processes. But also the idea was that the food that is grown there actually comes down to the commons. This is the landscape that I call the large public square that the hospital is giving back to the city for the purpose of consumption. And Wishard is one of these hospitals that really does practice what they preach. As part of their give back to the community, they actually have in the adjacent large park, Indianapolis, or White River State Park, they have a garden that is a slow food garden, teaching people what it means to look at vegetables for the purpose of consumption. We're all very educated here, and you have to realize that that is not understood. Most people think that frozen food and fast food are the points of consumption, and the only way to consume. Most people don't know how to cook what they see growing in the market. So part of this effort is actually to have a pedantic purpose within the community. And so the new commons has many elements to it. The most important to me is this aspect of cafe. So one of the last iterations before it went into construction was this particular plan, which involved a cafe here underneath a commons trellis and various features in this open landscape that serve multiple program elements, from yoga to theater to eating and celebrating, but always oriented towards the spectrum of Indianapolis's diverse community. And this is the cafe that been working on for that particular effort. early in October, I went back home for the opening of this particular project. It was actually my first project as a partner ever to be opened. I have to say that the work that I do, it can take 5 to 6 years to get something built, and this was the first effort under my own partnership that I saw realized. So this was the drawing that we did to represent this particular plaza, which was a street closing that would link the Frank Furness building of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts to the Hamilton building, which is the studios and school of that particular museum. And this is just before it opened, the day that the Oldenburg got placed on the site. And this is it just before it opened with Jordan Griska sculpture that is in the process of being inserted there. It's all about how, it's all about receiving the tush, quite honestly. How one sits in a public place is really important. The more you can get people to stay, the more interaction you're going to get out of people. And so the design of this curvilinear bench became, the real focal point of this socially sustainable landscape. And in the end, this is called success for me. That you bring people onto a site with the absolute pleasure of seeing them interact in a very positive way. So it is really about community when it comes to landscapes, whether they're urban or rural. I think the greatest challenge is actually the act of bringing people together. That's actually what's going to save the world. So part 2, a brief course in landscape theory. This is really my attempt to have some fun with the academics, because I am not an academic, so have at it after this, because I'm going to do my best. There is the typical landscape that you know, which is the breadth of the world. That is the place where the landscape exists. There's also the economic landscape, the place where numbers take place. And indeed, there's also the political landscape. And it's this thing that I think is really interesting, the notion of the political landscape, the spectrum of thought that has to do with how people present themselves, how people represent themselves. And it's what I wanted to talk with you about. So this is my little landscape theory course. These are the same place, separated by just a few years. This is Chiswick House in England. And this is one of my favorite landscapes. Every time I go to it, however, it either snows or rains or does something that's horrible, and I can never take really great photographs of it. But I continue to go back to it because actually this is seminal in both English philosophy and American philosophy of landscape. And it's a point at which a significant change happens to the history of England, and by proxy, eventually America. Up till that point, landscapes in England pretty much looked like Versailles. They had plats that were ornamented. They were literally about areas of manipulation where man subordinates nature and comes up with parterres. This happens to be Longleat House out of Britannia Illustrata. And this is in England, but all of those parterres have a relationship to France and to Dutch landscapes. That's because England up to this point had a significant relationship, in particular with the Netherlands, but really it was the fashion to do it this way. And it was really, at Versailles, it was absolutely about subordination. It was the king as monarch, looks down on the landscape. It is extended out to the vista, his ownership of the land. He looks down upon it. It is literally subordination of nature by one individual who is the ruler. And then comes the Grand Tour. And this is about us, because this whole lecture is literally about us. But what I wanted to do is try to figure out where's that connection to us as people visiting Rome and that significant shift. In the Grand Tour, particularly for those people coming from England, they were looking for new ideas. And after 1688, when the revolution took place in England, the monarchical powers began to shift and the parliamentary system slowly began to rise. So it was very important to start to think about what it meant to have a republican administration, that is, a true sense of republicanism as individuals governing themselves. So what was it that the Whig Party was going to be doing to represent that? You were getting imagery like this on the Grand Tour. It was becoming a consumable product. things that people began to take home with them on the Grand Tour. And you also began to get a great deal of interest in deciphering old texts, such as Pliny the Younger's description of his vacation homes, basically. This by Robert Castell in 1728. I think this is actually a fascinating document because of ruins, he had some sense of the vocabulary of structures, but he had no sense of what the landscape might be. And yet, Pliny the Younger is describing his landscape of his country home. He's using actually beautiful language, but what Castell is doing is actually interpreting it within the context of the current thinking in landscape. So you get this incredible hybrid that's happening with this particular document. Here is the home, and the rest of the landscape is surrounding it. It's not that Italianate landscapes didn't exist in England. They did. People were going on the Grand Tour in advance of the period that I'm talking about, but they were taking things either wholesale, literally saying, I love that landscape, I want to build it here, or they were taking it piecemeal. In the case of Langley, what I think is interesting, he was writing a treatise on the new principles of gardening, and what he does is abscond with a view of the Villa Pamphili. We all know this, the people like me who go out for a run in the Pamphili Park. This is the lake right here, drawn very much smaller, but there's the island in the center of it, and there's that course of water that leads up to the Baroque fountain, if you know the three cascades that I'm talking about. And what Langley does is he repeats the whole thing, except instead of the Baroque, he puts a ruin, which is a very interesting thought, and I ask you to park that and hold on to it, because it comes up a little bit later. These two men met on the Grand Tour. This is William Kent on the left, and Richard Boyle, the 3rd Earl of Burlington, on the right. They met in 1719 on the Grand Tour, and this is one of those kismet sparks that is really fascinating about life in general. It's what we're hopefully doing with our time here at the Academy. It's two people who are very different. This is a man of wealth. This is a man trying to make his living as a watercolorist and sometimes set designer. And they meet, and Burlington begins to support Kent in his efforts to learn about all things Roman. Burlington had an obsession with Palladianism as a symbol of republicanism, and he began to support Kent in his efforts to learn more about Italy and what Republican Rome, or the ideas of Republican Rome, might look like. Burlington, was shoveling his money out all over the place. He was hiring people like Isaac Ware to translate Palladio's books of architecture, and this is actually the frontispiece in which it's actually dedicated to Burlington from Isaac Ware. But Burlington himself was someday architect. I mean, he really wanted to try his hand as an architect, and he came up with this little gem, Chiswick House on the right. And it is so closely related to the Villa Rotunda, a place that he visited on his Grand Tour. But literally, he is trying to find some vocabulary that is representative of the Whig Party. The Whig Party of that time was the parliamentary side of government. They were the folks that were really trying to push the monarchy down after the death of Queen Anne and really raise a more common voice among the people. So this to him represented that symbol of republicanism. To some critics, it was actually too small to live in and too big for a watch fob. But for the purposes of our interests, it seems to fit quite well. John Roque gives us several renditions of it in his views of Chiswick, and in particular, I want to point out the west facade, largely because it expands out into a lawn that Kent designed when he returned. So this is happening in around 1730. After they had both returned from the Grand Tour. And what's interesting is the shift. This is no longer parterres. This is no longer floral patterns on the ground. It is literally something different. And it's the symbolism associated with that landscape that is important to us as we look at this. It is truly about what one experiences in the act of walking and seeing and connecting thoughts together. Kent's drawings for this western expanse initially started with an exedra, which would have been taken from a villa, but it ended in something quite different when it was finally iterated. His final proposal looked like this, which included statues that were purportedly taken from the Villa Hadrian as part of a grand tour, go out and purchase effort. And it is literally Caesar and Pompey confronted by Cicero. So it's literally the guy who was supporting republicanism against those that were thought to bring it down. And this may look absolutely benign to you, but it is a significant shift in the way that people were thinking about landscape and how those objects were deployed as part of the theater. Similarly, Kent was drawing things, initially the wooden temple, which ended up becoming the orangery. Here, a lake surrounded by orange trees in the summer and centered with an obelisk. But again, this was a novel way of looking at the landscape. It was truly taking these objects and trying to create a dialogue with them in a very different type of landscape. So Chiswick, this is interesting because it's sort of reminiscent of Castell's drawing of Pliny's villa, but this is Roque's plan and views of Chiswick. Here's the west facade that you saw earlier. The house sits right here, and there's that exedra form with Cicero and Pompey and Caesar. And this is actually the orangery lake with the temple. There are other places that are happening, that are changing at this time as well. In this case, Claremont. And Claremont is just south of London. It's really easy to get to if you have a car. It's quite a dynamic place. It's a wonderful, this is actually from Vitruvius Britannicus, again by Colin Campbell. He's documenting all of these estates prior, within the 1715, 1725 era. And you can see this is John Roque's plan of it with the views again, but this is 1736. And so this is the house. Here's the house. But you can see that all of the LAs, this very axial formality, the parterre gardens, etc., they have been significantly eroded, and the landscape has begun to change. There's a ha-ha deployed, which is a one-sided wall. There is a lake here that is no longer circular, but actually given more natural form. And I want to call your attention to this. This is actually a landscape theater, if you will. It is the Belvedere stairs of Rome rendered into a landscape form. And it is quite extraordinary. It's huge. It's not small in any respect. I don't think it was ever used as a theater, but it is symbolic in many ways. You can see it here in Roque's survey of the site, and this is what it is trying to replicate. So again, you get this connection between ancient Rome, from their perspective, and some contemporary iteration in the English landscape. And it's important to remember that this is a landscape that was, again, normally described in very different terms prior to this. Again, very floral, very patterned, not symbolic like this at all. This is another of Kent's design. This is for Rousham. Again, this is actually perhaps the most poetic of all of the landscape. It has incredible subtlety to it. And this is Bridgman's plan for it. I don't have Kent's plan. Bridgman, like the previous landscape, had a significant formality to the site. There's the house. The house is approached by a great allée. It comes onto a grass plat. This is the river Cherwell running through it. Bridgman straightens the edge along the house, adds various overlooks, adds two pools, which are very regular, very geometric. But what we want to do is look at these three things, and I'll show you these in a second, and I apologize again for not having the Kent plan. I couldn't find it. But one is this thing, this statue called Lion Attacking a Horse. The other is the Praeneste Terrace. And the third thing is the Veils of Venus, which we'll look at in just a second. So you have to sort of use your imagination about how this plan's actually changed in a moment. This is Schumacher's lion attacking a horse. It's a copy. It sits on the edge of the lawn plat. The river is right below here. And you're drawn out of the house into the back landscape. And you see this particular piece of sculpture. And the sculpture, actually, the original was in Tivoli. And it exists there. And if you remember this fountain, it's the one at the top by the cardinal's estate. And that particular statue sat in that position. This is comprised of what was considered to be a model of ancient Rome. And the horse was supposed to be Tivoli, the lion Rome, and the Rome was subordinating Tivoli. And the idea was that you would see the model of ancient Rome and then contemporary Rome in the distance, and begin to have this recognition take place. This fountain is really about the founding of Rome itself. There's the boat that carried Romulus and Remus are here. These are the original settlers coming in, Minerva, and the founding of Rome, and the river Tiber is a sculpture under here. But this isn't, Rauscham is not ancient Rome. So what do you do besides putting this symbol that of the horse being dominated by the lion? You do what Kent did, which was begin to manipulate property beyond your own contract. So he went into the landscape and actually took an ancient or a contemporary mill of the time and Gothicized it, and then put out here what's called the eye catcher. And so there in the landscape is the Gothic mill, and there in the distance is the eye catcher. And they're really wonderful constructs. This was a working mill that Kent just decided to Gothicize, if there is such a word. And it was really trying to create history where no history existed at the time. And in the distance was this eye catcher, which some have described as a triumphal arch. It is a ruin, if you will, but a ruin that is created. But it is really a stage set. It is a prop in the landscape. And when you eventually find it, because it's not easy to find how to get there, Jamie and I had the pleasure of walking through this barley field. He was a good sport in doing this. But I just love these buttresses, which really just sort of prop this thing up and make it something to be seen. But the whole notion was that you would be walking on the property of this estate and begin to make these connections. So too, the Veils of Venus. If you remember those very rectangular pools that Bridgman had designed prior to Kent's intervention, the Veils of Venus became something different once Kent was done with them. They became these forms that were actually inspired by the Villa Aldobrandini here in Frascati. And I just want to take this is going to be one of those slight sidetracks where you're going to park an idea, which is the idea of the three natures. And this is something that John Dixon Hunt espouses a lot, and I use as a designer quite often as a way of figuring out how I want a landscape to actually play out and how I want it to be both read and written. This is an interesting frontispiece because what it shows is the landscape in three forms. That which is closest to us is the most manipulated. That which is close to culture is the most refined. Then you have the agrarian landscape as the intermediary between the cultured landscape and the realm of the gods. And here are the gods in the forested lands playing the lyre and doing all the things that they do. But this concept of the three natures becomes important, not just in Renaissance design, because it's iterated there, but also in 18th century design and in designs, contemporary designs. Here's the Villa Aldobrandini sitting midway up the hill in Frascati. And what Kent was looking at, actually, was beyond the water theater. This is the water theater that sits immediately behind the property, Atlas supporting the world. But what we're interested in is actually what's beyond that in nature. And what we find are a series of three fountains that become more primitive as they move back in the landscape. So this was the fountain above Atlas that was this wonderfully Baroque construction. But by the time you get up the hill to the wellspring, it is this incredible rustication. And there's not much that exists of them anymore. Once again, Janie was a good sport and accompanied me out to see this in the middle of winter. But it is this wonderful concept that Kent begins to bring back to the landscapes of England at the time. So the Vales of Venus become this iteration of both rustication and font that sort of descends through landscapes. And then finally, in Praeneste, or excuse me, in Rousham is the Praeneste Terrace, the Temple of Fortune, which Kent places very appropriately in the significant bend of the Cherwell, so that you look up and downstream across to the Oxfordshire landscape and the eye catcher in the distance. So in this case, it's all about a narrative that gets laid out and understood and appreciated as one moves through it. So we have the concept of this sort of Palladianism, the republicanism in the landscape. It then in English landscape history moves to places like Blenheim, which is like English landscape on steroids, and then goes to the philosophical thinking about actually nature is not to be dominated by man, man is dominated by nature, and you get built ruins like that. And then the Industrial Revolution comes during the Victorian period, and the expanse of the empire brings back all of these wonderful plants that become a secondary reaction, and then finally the reaction to that is the cottage industry, the idea of William Morris, and so you get this incredible landscape history that happens in England that goes back and forth, but we're not going there because that's the rest of landscape theory and I don't want to deal with it now. I want to deal with this green line, which is actually the point at which the United States is founded. It's roughly 1776. So what happens is you get landscapes in the United States that are symbolically related to the republicanism that the Whig Party was trying to find, which is why we get buildings looking like capitals of Rome, as well as other structures. We also get lawn. And lawn doesn't grow well in the United States, but it's the thing that allowed all of those statues and temples to work in England. And if you look anywhere on the globe, lawn will work in places where the current, which is moving clockwise in the upper hemisphere or counterclockwise in the lower hemisphere, hits land at the northern point. So it works in England because that's where all the clouds and rain come from, and lawn loves to grow there. It also works in the United States in the upper northwest. Similarly, if you just did the reverse in the southern hemisphere, that's where lawn grows very well too. But for the rest of the world, lawn doesn't work. You just don't grow it easily. It takes a lot of manipulation. So like here in suburbia, it becomes a symbol of manifest destiny. It becomes the thing that we all have that connects us, that eventually becomes hedged, and then we become separate, and then we don't talk to each other, and et cetera, et cetera. It's this thing that is a very different product. Eventually, it comes back to Italy because they're looking to us and saying, hey, they have lawn, we can have lawn too. But it doesn't work here just as it doesn't work in the United States. So you get places like in front of the Victor Emmanuel statue where you can't touch it. It's literally surrounded by a fence. It's not programmed. It's just green. It takes up water. It takes up nutrients, but you don't touch it. And so it's a symbol that really doesn't work. It's just this thing. And lawn is great if you have I use lawn in my projects, but I use it where program requires flexibility. So where you want to have people come to watch a concert or a movie in the evening, or you want to set up various street fairs or things like that, it becomes a great place to pitch tents, but normally you don't want to be using lawn. This is one of those side notes. The Romans used water to their advantage. They had an extreme source of water. You see it all around you in the SPQR fountains, where we all fill up our bottles and drink it, but it's a very unique condition to have this much water accessible to people. The United States used, interestingly enough, this connection with water and power. This is actually the waterworks in Philadelphia, my hometown. This is a wonderful technological construct that actually served to suppress the various fevers that were attacking Philadelphia. In the center of town, there used to be this structure, which looks surprisingly like a Roman temple with an oculus that spews smoke. But this is actually the pump that pulled water into the town to allow that city to survive. And so you get, this wonderful vocabulary in the United States of structures representing both industry and this sort of the idea of a great nation. Part 3, an embassy of knowledge. So I just wanted us to think about a new Janus, a way of looking forward and backward, with two of our favorite gentlemen. And this, forgive me, it was fun. Fun at your expense. I began to think about when I couldn't do the Quarry project because the company was not allowing me onto the site, and I began to think about the fact that the founding partner of the studio that I used to work for, he was given the commission and he was a Rome Prize fellow in the 70s for 2 years. I thought, well, I'm the next fellow from that particular institution, Olin. Why don't I take on a new vision for the Academy's landscape? And so this is where this ends up going. But it's not, I wanted to talk about symbolism and embassies as a lead-in to this. I had the pleasure of working on the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. It was a competition win between Moru Budel and Hannah Olin at the time. It was an interesting time politically because it started prior to the African embassy bombings. And then when the African embassy bombings happened, everything got retrenched. And the landscape became more important because it had to be defensible. The building retreated. It became significantly, it's a very public site. This is in Pariser Platz in Berlin. And the landscape then had to mitigate security issues as well as symbolism. So you get, for the ambassador's terrace landscape, which overlooks the Quadriga, you get a symbol of agriculture on the right, and various other concepts of the American landscape, in this case, the landscape of the Northwest, throughout various parts of the embassy. It ended up being iterated as a backyard, the concept of a backyard, a backyard with Ellsworth Kelly, but a backyard nonetheless. But it was an extraordinary effort in trying to create a symbol for the United States while dealing with a great deal of thought on security. I had the opportunity to get Olin involved in the U.S. Embassy in London competition. I managed to get us on to get, of the 9 architects, 7 of them to agree to work with us. That way we could choose which 3 we could afford to work with, because it's a very expensive thing, competitions. And we chose Richard Meyer, Kieran Timberlake, and Morphosis to work with, and they ended up having to be 3 of the 4 that ended up to the finals. So we were, I took Morphosis, my colleague Dennis McGlade took Richard Meyer, and Hallie Boyce took Kieran Timberlake. Kieran Timberlake won, but I thought I would show you some of the thoughts that went into this guy right here. I think I was one of the first successful landscape architects to work with Tom Main. He's an incredibly interesting character. I was really honored because I came up with the big ideas, and that was very gratifying for me. What I began to think about was, I should say first, I'm sorry, Obama had a very different attitude than Bush about embassies. Bush had men with machine guns, rightly, because during his administration, 9/11 happened, but men with machine guns standing in front of every embassy. And so it became a really unnerving thing to go and visit embassies throughout the world. But Obama had a different attitude. He's like, let's kill them with kindness. And pardon the pun. But the idea was take away the machine guns, make the security as transparent as possible, and have somebody standing out there with their hand extended saying, welcome to the United States Embassy, how can I help you? That's a very different attitude in terms of design than the prior thinking. And so what we were given was the premise that it should be absolutely transparent, it should be a pavilion in the park, it should be something very open, and this is how we began to think about it. There are these things called ayats, that are in the Thames. They're islands of deposited stone that become settlements of land and settlements of people. It's actually the first folks to live in London were those that occupied ayats within London. And so I took this idea of an ayat and said, well, they eventually channeled the river Thames, but what if we took a remnant ayat and actually built the pavilion on top of that and tried to figure out how to make this part of the design. So the idea was to create this structure that sat prominently on top of the ayat and then deal with the security of it as well as the sustainability. The goals were that they were going to sell the embassy in Grosvenor Square, that money, $500 million, would pay for everything with this new embassy, but that this embassy would begin to pay for itself in its sustainable gestures. So every ounce of water had to be captured. It had to be generate energy. It had to do all the things that, as a representative to the world, that we wanted to, the best things of the United States out in foreign territory. And so for the ambassador's garden, I began to think about the relationship between two men, one English and one American, John Bartram and Peter Collinson. He was a Quaker cloth merchant. He was a farmer in Philadelphia. And the two of them had a long-standing conversation that dealt with plants. They actually exchanged plants. It was a plant trade that was going on largely to benefit Collinson. Bartram got a lot of money as a result, well, in quotes, a lot of money. But really, when you look down the street and you see that Magnolia grandiflora, that's because of John Bartram. That's a Native American plant that made its way to Europe because of these two gentlemen corresponding with each other. And so the ambassador's landscape was intended to be all Native American plants, and they would be distributed throughout the site, but largely within this parterre garden that everybody had to pass through in order to get into the building. Tom took it further because I was suggesting he could be the next Inigo Jones. And he took because this was London, he took the volume of St. Paul's and, at my suggestion, the Capitol building, and iterated an internal volume within the embassy that became this great common space. As I said, unfortunately, we did not win, but I thought, it was a great gesture towards symbolism as embassies go. And so I come back to this slide of Lenfest Plaza, and I come back to us at the Academy. I suggested to you that really how I defined success is the notion that two very different types of people might come together in a public space. I often say a chemistry professor and a young protester. And a result of this space that I've designed, they feel comfortable to sit next to each other. And in the act of sitting next to each other, they come up with a conversation. And that conversation generates an idea. And that idea, 10 years down the road, saves the world. I will have been successful because I created the place in which that idea was formulated. That's my kind of big, hairy, audacious vision of what landscape architecture can do for people, and it's how I drive my own practice. So too, I think this notion of coming together exists for us mostly in the concept of where we sit and dine. For the most part, we work behind oyster-colored big white doors, and then through the benefits of the Rome Sustainable Foods Project, we actually come and meet at tables. And this wonderful assortment of people comes together, and somewhere down the road, we're actually going to have some extraordinary idea. It might be between Bruno and Cyrus, but those two guys are going to come up with an idea that someday will save the world. And it's this notion that, here is this great amount of food, this one thing that actually unites us in support of the pursuit of knowledge. And that, to me, is an extraordinary vision, because suddenly I'm saying, oh, wait, the Rome Sustainable Foods Initiative does the same thing that I do as a landscape architect. And I really just want to see, in terms of the vision of our landscape, whether it couldn't be made more whole. Holistic, comprehensive view, a symbol of the United States on Roman soil, presenting to other people what the greatness of the United States can render. So a few metrics. This goes back to some of those tidbits that I set aside, and I really, really want to thank Marina Nicolier for, she did these beautiful diagrams for me. I am absolutely incompetent when it comes to things like Photoshop and other programs. She is my tutor, if you will. But fresh water is a finite element. It actually exists on this earth. In 500 BC, there were 100 million people. As of March 2012, there were 7 billion people. There's the same amount of fresh water then. There's the same amount of fresh water now. We all need fresh water to exist. So there's less of it per person. Of that amount of water, only 2.5% of it, on the globe, only 2.5% of it is fresh water. And of that, only 0.37% is accessible. So it's a small amount of water for a lot of people. So water should be considered a very precious resource. Park that. So too, food issues. If we start thinking about what it takes to allow one person to survive on an amount of acreage, 1 year of food per person, it takes 22,300 square feet, approximately 0.5 acres, to sustain one person. So the McKim and White site, the site that we are on right now, is 4.4 acres, just to give you some adjustment there. If you are a vegetarian for 1 year per person, fruits, grains, vegetables, you need approximately 20,000 square feet. 1 year of wheat, 3,000 square feet. 1 year of eggs for one person, 65 square feet. 1 year of dairy. Cows are not a very effective form of getting milk. Nubian goats are much better. I suggest Nubian goats. And 1 year of meat, 2 servings per week. It takes this many pigs. So just put that information aside and let's think about this. A lawnmower. Remember that thing that I said was not appropriate to this particular landscape? Lawn. Well, it takes 1 year of use. It puts out 54 pounds. And this is actually, if Brandon Taylor's here, he's my Cornell intern. There he is in the back. Thank you, Brandon. He did this research to help me figure this out. 1 year of use of a typical push mower, of which we have 2 in the back, and we actually looked up the model and figured out how much it does. 87 pounds of CO2 and 54 pounds of other pollutants per year. 1 hour of use is equal to 40 automobiles going for 1 hour. These are not very efficient, folks, if you're not getting this. 1 hour of use, 100-mile automobile ride for a single car. The Academy, one time to do the Academy lawn is 4 hours for the whole thing. So that's like going to Rome and Florence and back in a car each time they do the lawn here. So you might think maybe we should use less lawn. I don't know, maybe. Park it. Bruno. This is about balance. Excuse me. He's my little reminder of, there are good things and bad things in the world. It's all about balance. If the goal is use less water, use less energy, use less labor, but make ourselves more productive, that's a great goal. I know that there are many things that I'm not dealing with in this talk. There are code issues. There are the cost of Italian labor. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I'm not citing. I recognize that exists. This is not meant to be, heaven on earth. I recognize that there are realities, but it's about balancing these issues, and that's what I want us to think about when we're looking at these things. So, in my first year of graduate school, after graduate school in 1990, I joined Hannah Olin in Philadelphia, and they had received the commission from the Academy to do the Academy's landscape. It was considered a prestigious project, as well it should have been, and so I wasn't allowed to work on it because I was a newbie. But I got to watch the process, and this happens to be the existing conditions in 1989. I think it's very interesting to look at some of these things very quickly. There's a very disheveled Villa Aurelia here. A lot of different piecemeal things at Caraviglio. There is a flower garden, cutting garden here in the backyard, as well as the tennis court. A slightly larger orchard here. Anyway, it was a very interesting and enlightening thing to look at this drawing again, particularly when this was the drawing that became the vision plan. So this was the 1990 response from Hannah Olin. It's heavily dependent upon Gorham Stevens' plan of 1928. That's acknowledged in the text. I'm going to skip over a lot of the Academy's history, but this document here, which is the master plan that was put together by Hannah Olin, has a great summary of the history of the Academy. But you might look at this, given the document that you just saw, and think about some of the things that have changed. The proposal was to have a fellows walk that Stevens' plan actually acknowledged that there should be an axial relationship in the back of the property. So the tennis court is to be moved to the property adjacent to the embassy site, or the ambassador site. The Caravillo property has this wonderful clipped alley that leads down to the terrace. The Triangle Garden looks like the iteration of the overlook that used to exist there prior to the Academy's purchase. And the Villa Aurelia looks much more refined, including a secret garden in the back there. I would say that probably not a lot of this got built. There's a lot of things that come into play when it happens, when you make proposals like this. Whether there's money available, whether a donor likes it or not. There are a lot of things that can cause challenges to getting a vision created. But it was an interesting proposal. My attitude is, and this is the attitude in the industry, a master plan should be revisited every 15 to 20 years. An institution changes, people change, conditions in the world change, money changes between years. So every 15 to 20 years, you should have a new vision for where you want to go. It's called an adjustment or a framework. This is the existing condition. I used to be very proficient at Photoshop. I was one of the first kids at Harvard to have a computer on his desk, so I used to do this all the time. I have not been able to do Photoshop in years, and so I want to thank Marina for helping me learn Photoshop again, because this was a pleasure to do, although it took me months to do this drawing. This is basically the previous drawing photoshopped into the current conditions. So it's the plan of the campus as it exists now. And what I wanted to talk with you about as I close up is just this portion right here and make some suggestions. It would be political suicide to come here and tell you this is what should be done. I haven't talked to anybody about this. I'm just suggesting that there might be some things that we want to think about given the metrics that we've seen, the symbolism that we've seen, the things that we want to promote as Americans on a foreign soil, and this pursuit of knowledge that we all try to do. So we're going to talk about the front yard first. It is largely lawn. It's a beautiful entry. It is verdant green. It is a great symbol of the American Academy and America in general. But that's a lot of lawn to use. And wouldn't it be better to actually use something that did not require as much water, such as Thymus praecox, which is a verdantly green product or plant. It grows to the ground, close to the ground. It is a Mediterranean plant. Once it's established, it needs little water. It has the other benefit of blossoming in the spring, so it's this white carpet. It also, because that lawn is not walked on very much, when people do walk on it, you get the fragrance of thyme floating up from it, but it can take people walking on it the way that we used to walk to the lecture hall when it was in Colin's studio in the fall. It can take that kind of abuse, but it doesn't require a lawnmower, and it doesn't require sprinklers once it's established. Similarly, the backyard, which is a beautiful verdant landscape, it really does. It's just lovely. It is a backyard, and we use it all the time. It's incredibly flexible. It allows us to have our parties, our future soccer games, other events that take place here. But it is intensively watered, and it is not a landscape that is native to this area. So what happens when you get too much water going into a landscape like that is you lower the productivity because it causes what's called navel orange split. Any of those fruit trees that gets too much water, the fruit grows too quickly because they're being inundated at a time when the fruit is ripening, and the skin can't expand quickly enough. Therefore, you get the splitting that takes place, and the product becomes useless. So if you want a greater productivity, it's actually beneficial to reduce the amount of water. Just keep it in mind when you're thinking about the Rome Sustainable Foods project. I go back to the concept of the three natures and say, well, what if this were an organizing principle for how the academy could be rendered as a landscape? And this is my realm of the gods. It's this area that is against the Aurelian Wall, and then along the backside of the Triangle Garden, and the wall that leads down to the overlook of the Acqua Paolo. And wouldn't it be great, actually, if that were a part of our productive landscape, where the more wild things like berries and chestnuts and other things that the Academy wants to ingest or have as product could be harvested. These would be plant materials that are not ornamental necessarily, although they're beautiful because they would flower. They would do many other things besides just be productive. But they're the type of thing that you would venture out into and collect. Similarly, and this is part of an issue for me, and I recognize that I'm an outside observer. I've only been here as long as most of you have, which is 7 months. The idea of the Rome Sustainable Foods Project is an extraordinary one. But from my perspective, and this is my opinion only, so I just put it out there, the union between the concept of the Academy and the Rome Sustainable Foods Project is a sliver, and it should be holistically embraced in such a way that it still has identity. You can still, have its own identity, but that the Academy actually represents a greater symbol of which that is a smaller part. Everybody wins in that way, and actually, when you think about the landscape as this full spectrum view of a culture, it's actually incredibly valuable. It's valuable in terms of the cultivation of prospective donors. It's valuable in how we describe ourselves in literature. It's valuable in so many other ways than just thinking about it as this, there's this thing, and we join it at the table, and that's it. It's why you get, the best thing about this is we get people out there helping, and you get a man who is absolutely a zealot when it comes to these things, sometimes uncontrollably, sometimes less than diplomatically, but he is out there. I love Chris. He's like, gotta get it done. And, but it benefits us as well. This is my tribute to Piranesi. I just love this photograph. One Saturday, I was helping in the kitchen, and we went out to pick nettles. I think Siobhan was with us, and Philip, who was here previously. But this notion that you get this full loop where fellows are in there helping out on Saturdays, and we're trying not to screw it up as best we can, but still learn a little bit and have fun. It's a great sort of story to tell, and it actually represents capital if it's embraced from the top down, and especially in the middle, where it can be a great story. And out of it, you get this extraordinary product that's called food that then supports people who want to think. And that notion is incredibly poetic to me. When it comes to the Carovillo, it would be great if actually we could expand some of the beds. Not necessarily beautiful beds, as in parterre beds of landscape, but what if this was a place where we actually, if we carved out a site that actually became the place where we produced a significant number of herbs. If you look at the tally sheet for the Rome Sustainable Foods Project, we spend a lot of money and obtain a lot of product that is herb related. And it doesn't require a lot to grow, but it would be a great thing to cultivate. So why not use that land more effectively? In terms of the 5B driveway, it would be great actually if we thought about the fact that people are passing through this, not just as in terms of arrival by car, but people who are walking from 5B into the property. And if we think about the fact that the issue here is the width of this gate, that as long as we maintain that as a point of access, it would be great if actually we pulled the trees out from the side and used them as a part of canopy so that cars could park underneath them and be in the shade, and that their roots wouldn't interfere with the adjacent buildings, but that it becomes an alley that people walk through, so it becomes part of the process of the promenade from the people in 5B into the backyard. Similarly, how we think about the knowledge of the library, which is central source for any institution. The most important thing is the library, because that's the source of knowledge, the representation of knowledge. How one represents the landscape outside of its main windows should be considered. And I don't necessarily think that this is the best thing. And I recognize that, again, this is where Bruno's balancing. It's really about how you think about servicing the backyard, how you think about accessing, dealing with HVAC issues, all of the things that we don't necessarily think about as a day-to-day issue. But it doesn't necessarily have to look like this with all of that. And so that's one of the things I'd like to be investigating. And then in terms of the last area of the academy, the Triangle Garden as a place to play. I understand, and I may be wrong, that generally speaking, the kids are not supposed to be in the backyard necessarily. The idea was that the kids go to the front yard or to the Triangle Garden. But that's hampered by the fact that there is a lock that requires a key, and it's incredibly exposed. It's literally like being in the, kids don't like to play in the front yard. They don't like to be face down by the building. It's too proper. What kids like are hedges where they can go hide. And when you do watch the kids play in the occasional time when they're in the front Triangle Garden, they literally are playing between the hedge and the fence on the street side or back by the mulch garden. They're rarely playing in the swings. They're rarely playing in the exposed areas. So what if we simply took the Triangle Garden and actually treated it like one of those London local blocks where they basically hide them within a hedge and people have a key, but instead of a key, we use a swipe card on the front gate so that a parent doesn't have to hold the kid, find the key, open the thing, throw the kid in, all that stuff. All you do is swipe it and go in, right? It becomes our place. But you have a hedge that exists up to 6 feet. You can still have the aerial hedge, you can still have every other element, but that hedge then allows it to become less formal and a place where everybody can go for an aspect of privacy, but it's still symbolically part of the vocabulary of the formal front yard. And then just this last thing. If we're meant to be seen or we're meant to see, you have to have it happen. So that means there has to be some aspect of our arboriculture that allows, and cooperation with neighbors, that allows the academy to play the same role that the French Academy, which is unfortunately positioned where there are no trees in front of it, if we're going to look down on them, sorry Camille, then we should at least protect that view. So from my aspect, landscape architecture is really about the notion of being. It's about all of us together collectively thinking about great things and coming up with ideas that actually foster a better future for our grandnieces and grandnephews than for ourselves. The great thing about landscape is it actually iterates through entropy. It is this thing that has the balance between static systems and living systems and then changes over time. I design for people of that age or younger, and that is my purpose as a designer. I came here as a pelargonium. These two things are geraniums. This is a pelargonium, so never call this a geranium anymore. That's your lesson for tonight. You write that one down. This is from South Africa. It's a hothouse flower. My big thing is that I came here as kind of a hothouse flower. I was a partner in a big firm, and part of my goal actually was to become a cranesbill geranium, which is a Native American plant that is hardy and blooms vigorously every year. And so I consider myself a geranium in transition. And I thank you all for all the things that you contribute to the, my own personal growth. I have to say that when I did my interview with Adele, and I was offered the 11 months, she's like, I really hope you'll consider the 11 months. It will be transformational. And I wasn't quite thinking it was going to be this transformational because I have a new firm, and I've off on a new road thanks to the support of all of you. It has been an extraordinary adventure thus far, and it continues to be something that I look forward to in terms of change and in terms of enrichment and in terms of delight. I have hope that in the future, the landscape of the Academy, which represents all of you and me together holistically, is the best representation of America on foreign soil. So I leave you with that food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We now throw the floor open for questions.
David, that was phenomenal. Oh, I'm not allowed. Oh, sorry. David, that was phenomenal. That was dazzling. That was just amazing. Thanks for doing that. This is a really simple question. I was just curious, with the hospital that you were working on, with the garden there, I was curious to know if in addition to contributing food back to the community, if they were thinking about actually using some of the food to serve to their patients.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I probably didn't make that completely clear. The cafe serves both the community and the idea, when I was hired, the guy who is the CEO said, I want this to be, if somebody has 2 hours at Indianapolis Airport, I want them to come here as one of the 2 places that they might go. The Colts Stadium being the other one probably. But, and so the idea was to create a balance between serving the people who are very different than us that would go to this hospital. When I first went for the interview, the one thing that I noticed sitting in the lobby waiting to be taken back to this gentleman's office was the size of the people that were moving in and out of this hospital. Obesity is a significant problem, and as I was hopefully suggesting, if I didn't say it, I meant to, that most people don't know how to deal with food. And so this is intended to be, that cafe that I was representing is intending to be a place where it offers tutorials to people about how to deal with fresh food, how to cook it fast, how to make it easy, how to do all the things that McDonald's does, but not McDonald's. How do you cook something that doesn't come in a freezer? And that's what that's about.
That is part of it.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. That was unbelievably fantastic.
Thank you.
Maybe one observation, David. I personally had never realized your ambition to bring people together so completely admirable. I never realized the extent to which in landscape architecture it's tied up with a supreme ingenuity and a genuine originality about thinking about ways to do that. In so many of the projects you showed, it was just looking at a landscape and seeing completely new ways.
It's a way of thinking about design that actually is not. It's not endemic to the discipline necessarily. People are not necessarily taught to do that. My way of thinking about it, it's the first sieve of design. I'm not about laying a graphic down on the ground and extruding it and saying, isn't that wonderful? Because that's faddish. That will last a minimal amount of time, and it doesn't serve a purpose other than lauding the person who did it. What I try to do is still get the accolade, because I want to be applauded, but try to think about it in terms of what gestures will possibly push the social issue the furthest and be lasting, so that it's contemporary and timeless at the same time.
One other question is with regard to lawns and beds of wild thyme. What's the status with other foreign academies in Rome and lawns? And do they all use lawns? And have any of them already made the switch?
I don't remember seeing at the British School that there was a lawn, and I don't remember at the Villa Medici that there was lawn. There's a lot of parterre gardens there. But they're about 17 acres. We're about 11 acres. And I guess, so I can't really answer your question. I don't know, but it's something worth investigating. I also, thanks to Brandon, did this, I wanted to see what we looked like compared to Itati in terms of acreage and compared to the Villa Medici, because they are both swings in economy, like you got Itati, which is Harvard, with a lot of money, and you got the Medici landscape there, which is heavily intensive because of the nature of the design. And so you want to look at those and find the best things about them in terms of their economy by still getting design and beautiful aspects of it, but on a scale that can be afforded.
Thank you, David. I want to follow up on the lawn question, but first a comment. Just to echo what Ariel said, not only dazzling, but inspiring as well. So thank you very much. And coming from a scholar, I think you formulated an argument brilliantly. So.
Thank you.
So I know you were worried about that. I thought it was very convincing to me. But as you know, this is something I'm passionate about as well. And it's rare that I feel so inspired again, because I usually just nod and agree. But the way that you formulated it was, I think, key in that inspirational moment. But I just wanted you to comment a little bit more on Americans' love affair with lawns. And maybe put it into I really like the three natures idea, and maybe if you could put it in the context, where does the lawn fit in there? And I guess where is, it's so symbolic, it's so seen as so symbolic of America now, that how do we go about changing that view that it is symbolic now? Because you made the case that it's not really, it shouldn't really be part of what North America is, the United States, that geography is not part of, it doesn't really have lawns naturally, but it's been adopted as such. And so how do we, I guess, get away from that, or how can we transition from it, and does the three natures maybe have any role in that? So.
Well, if you want to link it to the three natures, it is that sort of cultivated, it's the most cultivated aspect. It takes an incredible amount of resource, to grow a lawn. So even though it's not a parterre garden per se, it is a parterre. It is a representation of a cultivated plant, suppressed to fit the form that we want it to fit, therefore recognizing our own dominance over it. So symbolically, it is that aspect of cultivation, which is why we probably have it around our little homesteads, one next to the other, next to the other, next to the other. It's interesting also, when you think about those people who have tried to buck the system and said, well, I'm going to let it go as a natural meadow, that the codes come in and people get fined for growing something that is not manicured for the sake of benefiting themselves, but actually it does it to their neighbors, it's seen as demeaning their property, right? It reduces the value of their property because it's not seen as something that is beautiful or beneficial. So it's really an aspect of a matter of time. I think actually instead of growing meadows in front, it would be better to have true gardens, but gardens that are appropriate to the landscape that is of that place. And then you keep the backyard as the thing that is the programmable space, right? The space that allows you to do multiple things, which is what lawn is good for. So if we were able to, and I'm not suggesting that you take the Villa Pamphili garden, which is that wonderfully Baroque gesture on the land, but if you thought about that as their front yard, and you put the lawn in the backyard, that would be a better iteration of it.
Other question? Oh, Tim's.
That was brilliant. Sign me up for being in any place that you have designed. Thinking about the Triangle Park and the children, your insight, I think, is absolutely right, that what they want is a place that is private, and often, sometimes the smaller the better. I'm curious to know what, in the best of all possible worlds, would be on the ground in the Triangle Park.
Well, that's an interesting thing to say. I think once you put it behind a hedge and it becomes this other world, because that's what the kids want. They want another world. They don't want the formal world. They want a place where their imagination can run wild, where they can have fun and chase each other and do all the things that we've forgotten how to do as adults. But I don't think it necessarily has to be all lawn. I think whatever is visible from the front gate should be something manicured. I don't think time would necessarily withstand the, as in THYME, would withstand the incessant footprints of children running on it, but so it might be a place where lawn should be grown if it were durable. But there are many other materials that are not living that could be put down discreetly for kids to play on. Kids will play anywhere. In fact, they do play anywhere a lot of the times. It's hard to say because there's no plant necessarily that would be durable. It would probably have to be a different type of material.
Yes. It was absolutely wonderful, David.
Thank you.
I have a very practical question about the time lawn. I mean, how difficult would it be to establish a lawn of time? And
it shouldn't be that difficult, given the climate that we're in. The idea would be to you still need irrigation initially to get anything established. It's hard unless you knew exactly when it was going to rain here in Rome in the spring or the fall, which is when you would want to plant something like that. So over the course of a year, you may need to water something like that periodically while it's getting itself established. But that particular plant is, if not vigorous. Thymus praecox is one of those things that just spreads like wildfire and reroots itself as it moves along. So once it gets to a point where it's connected itself to each other, weeds can't grow, or very few weeds can grow because they're blocked out.
yeah. And in terms of types of soil?
It's really just, it doesn't need to be heavily full of organics. It actually could be a sandy loam, which is the type of thing that lavender grows in. That's what a Mediterranean soil is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sandier loam,
Mm-hmm.
more sand than not. It needs to percolate well.
Yeah.
And I should have said, for the areas that I was recognizing the orchard and the other areas, and the vegetable parterre in the backyard, I meant to say that was intended to be just, you would reduce the amount of water so water would not hit that, and you would just let meadow come up underneath it. The idea was that it should look like the orchards that are on the hills of Rome, and that there should always be standard trees in the agrarian landscape, not multi-stem. Those go to the realm of the gods. So there's this order that gets created as a result of the concept and how things get distributed. For clarification, and I apologize for not recognizing it, I don't think actually any of the projects that I represented, with the exception of the ARC Wildlife Competition, is a green site. All of them are brown sites. They're all or gray sites. They're all, the hospital is actually, they were tearing down a whole bunch of structures in order to get that land. There is a creek that used to run along that portion, and we were trying to recognize that within the drainage system. It doesn't exist anymore, but there were some aspects of the design showing through for that, and actually helping the stormwater management system. If it existed there before, why not work with those topographic lines to allow water to be captured in that. The Paffa Plaza was formerly a street. You never know what's going to be underground in Philadelphia, and certainly the design was hampered several times by things that they found that were never mapped. Even the ARC Wildlife Competition had I-70 running through it, and so this was a gesture of imposition on the natural system. We were trying to reconnect the natural system by pulling a landscape up and over that represented not plants that the animals wanted to eat necessarily, but represented plants that were an aspect of normalcy to the animals. The idea was not to bring the animals up and have them graze on top of the bridge. The idea was to actually have them move over it in such a way that they don't even recognize that they're on a bridge. And so you don't attract them with food, you attract them through creating movements of natural landscape, or quote-unquote natural landscape, that they would want to be in, such as hedgerows and other things that were moving across that particular thing. So I'm always conscious of the history of sites. You cannot not be in landscape. There is always something that came before. We at Olin and my own firm now, Land Collective, don't work on green sites. It's not appropriate to work on green sites. There are too many other sites that brown, black, gray, that need to be worked and worked more positively. And that's actually where you can have a great time playing with history as it represents itself on the landscape.
I think we have to adjourn for dinner, but many, many thanks, David.
Good. Thank you all. That was the best damn thing I've ever heard. Oh my God.
Seriously, I was blown away by it.
Oh my God,
I
thank
thought
you.
it was fantastic.
Oh,
And,
it's-
you know, I was ready to storm the gates, then I reminded myself I actually work here, so no need to. But that was, I loved every millisecond.
Oh my God.
And at the start, I mean, now I feel this pressure to have this, you know, sort of accelerated conversation, and that's the point. So, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I
you're
mean,
very
like-
kind. I hope you'll share it with your other colleagues.